Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the 2020 Bibliometrics and Research Assessment Symposium. My name is Chris Pelter, and I'm acting as the MC for this event. Welcome back. I do have just a couple of quick housekeeping announcements in case anybody just joined. We are recording the session, but we're not recording anything regarding the attendees, so you feel free to participate in the event without being part of the recording. Audio for attendees is in broadcast only mode, so you don't need to join the audio session and you are automatically muted, so there's no need to do anything special on that regard. We are handling all of our questions through the chat box. We have a number of folks monitoring the chat and who will be following up with you, so please do use any questions. Send those questions to the chat box, and please remember to send questions to everyone and not to the hosts specifically. If you send them to the hosts, we're busy doing other things and we're not necessarily going to be able to see them. So please send them to everyone, and one of our chat monitors will have a look and be able to help you. Finally, live captions are available in the multimedia viewer panel, so you can go ahead and expand that and get your live captions that way. So with that, we're going to now transition into the first of our panel sessions. This panel session is now going to be about alternative metrics. Up first, we have Euan Adie of Overton.io to talk about assessing research impact on policy and practice with the gray literature. Euan, are you there? Euan, I think you might still be muted. I can unmute you if necessary. Let me try unmuting you and see what happens. I don't see anything in the chat, so let me try unmuting you. Hello, Euan, are you there? Okay, perhaps Euan's having trouble connecting to the audio session. Jed, I see that you're also on. Would you mind going ahead and presenting first? Are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine. Yep. So let's go ahead. I'll make you the presenter.
All righty.
And if you want to go ahead and get set up.
All right, can everyone see my screen okay?
Yep, I can see it just fine.
All right, fantastic. So hi everyone, my name is Jed. I'm a postdoc at University of Washington. Today I'll be talking about a project that we just published a couple weeks ago, looking at how bioarchive preprints are discussed on social media and trying to make sense of the different audiences that are engaging with that, both in terms of altmetrics and kind of transforming that into understanding various impacts. So this was published in PLOS Biology, so feel free to follow along there if there's any details I'm cutting out for the sake of time. So a little bit about myself, just because it's relevant to why I'm here in the first place. My background is actually in bioinformatics and human population genetics. I'm currently a postdoc with Kelley at University of Washington. So yeah, I don't really have the kind of research librarian background that a lot of you do. I've always been kind of more of a consumer of altmetrics and bibliometrics and whatnot. So the sort of research I do, excuse me, is much more concerned with basic human population genetics research, understanding patterns of human migration and patterns of genetic variation and how that varies across populations and kind of influences various phenotypes. So I'm fairly active on Twitter myself. That's a great way to connect with colleagues and follow the research. But yeah, ever since being a grad student, I've always been really interested in, following who actually is tweeting about research in my field. Obviously myself and my colleagues, but, there might be a paper that comes out like this looking at a genome-wide association study trying to link genes to human intelligence. And, we can look at the altmetric page, and, this is obviously a kind of a hot topic and attracts a lot of attention, even as a preprint. So this preprint got a few hundred tweets. Altmetric lets us drill down and look at those specific tweets, and, it might be pretty nondescript, just kind of tweeting basically the title of the paper. But the identity of the people who are tweeting about a paper is really interesting. Kevin McDonald, if you Google that name, you might come across the Southern Poverty Law Center, which has a profile on him, describing him as the neo-Nazi movement's favorite academic. He's a vehement anti-Semite, and I think it's pretty clear from just seeing him tweeting about this paper, sort of where he might be going with the implications of that. So yeah, since grad school, I've really taken an interest in kind of understanding how my particular field gets, picked up and appropriated by white supremacists and the far right. And there's been various media coverage of that phenomenon, and I've kind of contributed some qualitative observations to that. But what I really wanted to do and kind of demonstrate to people in my field is how we can actually quantify that and measure it and think about this sort of extremist appropriation as scientists and not just sort of qualitative observers. And of course, context is vital to making sense of altmetrics, as Elizabeth highlighted in her keynote. We want to know who's tweeting about the paper, what they're saying about it, and when and where they're doing so. Altmetric, I think, does a good job of kind of acknowledging that that context is really vital to interpreting altmetrics. And they, of course, have kind of a demographic breakdown of who's tweeting about a paper into these coarse categories of members of the public or scientists, practitioners, et cetera. But that's not really satisfying. It doesn't tell us who those scientists are, who those members of the public are, and what exactly they're saying about research and what they might be doing with it. Part of the challenge of that is that altmetrics audience classification is really based on individual Twitter bios, which are prone to sparsity and noise and all sorts of issues that make it difficult to actually classify users. So I like to think that my own Twitter profile is informative and gives people a sense of what I do and my various interests. Compare that to my PhD advisor, who has a completely empty bio, or a member of my PhD committee who had a somewhat vague, laconic bio. And even though those two are much more prestigious scientists than myself, altmetric would likely have a very challenging time trying to classify them as scientists. So with this project, what we really set out to do was find a way to segment Twitter audiences into granular informative categories in such a way that we can actually get into and drill down to some of those questions of context. Of course, scientists are often engaging with research on Twitter themselves, so we wanted to be able to measure how the academic community is actually influencing those metrics. And of course, my kind of the impetus for all of this was to think about kind of this extremist engagement and be able to rigorously quantify that. And finally, on a more positive note, we wanted to be able to maybe identify some new indicators of impact and interdisciplinarity through this project. So the basic idea we had was to look at patterns of network homophily. This is the idea that your personal networks, both in person and online, tend to reflect characteristics about yourself. So I'm a population geneticist. I'm followed by other population geneticists. Looking at their bios should carry some information about my own personal identity in my career. here's a graphical example from a study Facebook did, just showing that networks tend to kind of self-organize according to political ideology, which of course we should expect, particularly in a very polarizing year politically. So we kind of adapt this to think about how we can capture audience characteristics of people tweeting about a paper. So suppose we have two users who tweet about a paper. They, essentially broadcast that to their audience of followers. Each of those followers has their own Twitter bio, consisting of words that, again, we hope are informative. They may not always be accurate or even honest, but essentially we expect that they reflect characteristics of the original focal user. And then we compile those into what we call an audience document, strip out stop words and kind of get the core keywords reflecting that total audience of each user. And then Chris gave a very nice breakdown of LDA, so I won't go too much into the details there, but essentially we're applying this topic modeling approach to extract what we'll call audience topics, just groups of keywords, vocabularies that frequently co-occur. So in this case, we might have one topic indicating more of a science-y type audience and one indicating someone who's just really into their pets and pizza and probably takes pictures of them. And so each of the focal users can be represented as sort of a composite of these inferred topics, which gives us, really rich qualitative information as well as quantitative information kind of about the audience as a whole. So the data that we collected, we scraped a collection of some of the most highly tweeted preprints on bioRxiv from a service called Archivist, developed by some colleagues at University of Minnesota. For each of those preprints, we hit the Bibliometrics API to collect all of the users that tweeted about it and were indexed. We had a total of about 300,000 such users. And for each of those, we then went to the Twitter API and scraped all of the information about their followers. So this is a massive amount of data numbering in the hundreds of millions of observations. And so, yeah, our hope was that this would give us this really rich information that we wanted. So I'm going to walk through a quick example. This is a study that used a deep learning approach to model how animals sync and swarm together. The first author of the paper put out this nice tweet, promoting his work. I put up some cool animations that really caught people's attention, kind of showing how the method works. And when we, scrape the tweets, look at the follower bios and try to break down that audience, here's the list of topics we found. So they're color-coded, each indicated by kind of the list of the top associated keywords, topics that we believe to be, indicative of academic communities are indicated with a little mortarboard there. And for each user, we can then represent them as a horizontal stack of bars. So the color corresponds to the topic, and the length of each segment corresponds to the kind of probabilistic assignment. So a user that's just one big red bar is kind of wholly associated with this first topic relative to the other users. Importantly, this paper was submitted in the animal behavior and cognition category of bioRxiv. There's several different subject areas you could submit these preprints to. So then for each of the academic topics, we looked for essentially keywords that might map onto these subject areas. So this first topic maps onto animal behavior and cognition, which is exactly what we'd expect. We can do that for various other of these academic topics, which might point to some indicators of interdisciplinarity of this research, or at least of the people who are interested in this research, which we think is a really cool direction to take this in the future. Overall, we found that these mappings actually really closely agreed with the actual subject area, which is a nice validation of our method, and for the most part, those audience topics that did map onto the subject area tended to represent a large fraction of the audience, again, which is sort of exactly what we would hope for. This paper also had a number of non-academic audience sectors, notably video game developers and AI industry insiders and graphic designers. which we thought was a really cool trace of, potential economic and cultural impacts of this work. Maybe something the authors could mention in a grant and say, look, here's some potential applications that we weren't even aware of when we set out to do this particular research. As you might expect, most Twitter attention for preprints does come from the academic community. This is just a scatter plot each point of the paper, and x-axis is the fraction of the audience that are scientists according to altmetric, y-axis is according to our estimates. We find that nearly all of the preprints we looked at have majority academic audiences. We do have some evidence that our estimates tend to be much higher than altmetrics. This, of course, can potentially influence how the scores are interpreted. We, in our paper, kind of discuss how we think our method is actually more accurate. But not to step on anyone's toes at altmetric, I think they do a really fantastic job, and that was a lot of the inspiration for this work. One of the things we found with the non-academic audience sectors is they often polarize by political ideology. So we devised a scheme to, measure that polarization based on kind of politically coded keywords and emoji, et cetera. And we found, some subject areas like ecology and immunology have much more left-leaning audiences. You could imagine ecology often includes climate change papers, which tend to be more part of that political platform. On the right side of things, we also see similar, very strong polarization, especially for notably genetics and genomics, which is my own area of expertise. Like I said, I had sort of gone at this, expecting that we'd find some evidence of political extremism. I was really astounded by how common that actually was. So this is another paper looking at sex differences in gene expression in the human fetal brain. We have, 3 very overtly right-wing audience sectors, including topic 5 there, with white nationalists right in the top associated keywords. Overall, we found 70 of our 1,800 preprints had at least one audience sector that was, again, kind of overtly white nationalist. And when present, those audience sectors could contribute a massive amount to the total audience, as much as a quarter. To make sure this wasn't just an artifact of our LDA model, we looked more explicitly at patterns of network homophilies. To say we have one user followed by a collection of 75 users, and say 15 of those also follow former KKK Grand Wizard David Duke. We would call that a measure of homophily of 20%, which is pretty extraordinarily high compared to what we see across all users. And so we defined a threshold to basically say anything more than 2% is a pretty strong enrichment of that sort of network homophily. When we examine that across all the preprints in our data set, we find about 10% of preprints actually have audience sectors with strong white nationalist network homophily, most common in a few particular areas of research. Again, these are areas of research that concern, kind of politically sensitive topics in the first place, like intelligence and population differences, sex differences, et cetera. And what's really shocking is in extreme cases, these audiences can actually account for over half of all the tweets referencing a preprint, which raises all sorts of uncomfortable questions with how we as scientists are distributing our research and, potentially benefiting from this negative engagement. So to wrap things up, we find, we have this framework to essentially drill down to really granular, detailed information about Twitter audience sectors. Most of the audience attention is coming from scientists themselves, so I think this is a good indicator that we have room to improve our own science communication and engagement efforts. We do have this very disturbing trend of engagement from extreme right-wing networks that I think we as a community really need to grapple with. And finally, we do reveal some potentially positive applications of research and opportunities for interdisciplinary connections. So we have a nice little interactive dashboard that you can take a look at. Thanks to Altmetric for the data, and feel free to check out our paper. Happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Jed. And thanks for jumping in for us. Kelley?
Yeah, hi, Jed. We have several questions for you. So the first one is that what's your reaction as an academic to such groups potentially misusing your work? Does it put you off being so active in sharing your work on Twitter?
Yeah, it's a kind of hard space to be in because, on one hand, I think Twitter is a really powerful tool for scientists to connect and engage with just a curious public. But on the other hand, I've been kind of auditing this paper's attention on Twitter, and it's been retweeted by like several very obvious kind of white nationalist extremists, questioning the validity of the results and et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I don't have a good answer to that question, other than it's something I think we need to struggle with over the next few years as we kind of transform our publishing and research assessment practices.
Thank you. Next one. Did you eliminate bots from the analysis? And if so, how? And what about incomplete or non-descriptive bios? For example, I have emojis for my bio.
Yeah, we didn't try and filter out bots just because that's tricky to automate at scale like this. Emoji were included in the audience documents. Obviously an empty bio doesn't count towards anything, but again, the hope was that by looking at multiple follower bios in aggregate, we would still get some sense of things. There are some interesting, maybe non-random patterns of missingness that we started to explore. But yeah, that's happy to talk about that in more detail via Slack or elsewhere.
Okay, 2 more questions and then we'll move on, all right? Okay, do you have any thoughts about how to separate scientists into those actively employed in academia versus those that were trained as scientists but employed or working outside of academia?
We don't really distinguish that at this point, just because, again, it's the representation is all based on your followers. So if you're in industry and still maintain those social network connections with with people from your alma mater or whatnot, you'll still be kind of lumped in with that academic community. And of course, there's you can still be in industry and publish and be really engaged with the literature in the same way. So I think there's some potential ways we can try to get at kind of the academic versus industry divide, but not something we've looked at too thoroughly.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question here. So are you able to do further analysis on how likely these people following extremists are actually extreme themselves? For example, some people may follow simply to diversify their views and know what the other side are talking about.
Yeah, there's certainly some potential for noise there. And we try to be very clear in the paper that we're not saying if you associate with this particular community on this quantitative level that we're not pointing the finger at you and saying you're a white nationalist, stop tweeting about our papers. So it's again, it's not something we can really get at strictly based on just follower associations. I think you can always argue like if 20% of your followers are also following David Duke or Richard Spencer, that's probably an indication that you share some similar characteristics to David Duke and Richard Spencer. But again, with the huge caveat that we're not going to point fingers in that way specifically.
Thank you, Jed. Sorry, I think we have to move on. So if you have time, could you look at the chat? I believe there are still maybe 2-3 more questions for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can feel free to redirect.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, and thank you again for jumping in. So up next, let's try again with Euan to see if we can get him on board. So Euan, are you there?
Yep. Hi, everyone.
Hey, fantastic. All right.
Sorry for dropping out earlier. All right, I'll just share my screen.
So looks great. I can hear you. So take it away.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thanks, everyone. And thanks, Chris and Yelling, for hosting this event. I'm very pleased to talk to you all. Very briefly, my name is Euan Adie. I work for a company called Overton. My background is actually in altmetrics. I worked for Nature Publishing Group for a long time, and then I founded a company called altmetric.com, which we heard about just in the last presentation. But I'm not here to talk about that. What I wanted to talk about is going a bit beyond scholarly citations, and specifically about policy documents and the scholarly citations that they cite. This is quite a short presentation, so it's going to be a 10,000-foot view kind of thing, but what we can do is try and answer the question here at the bottom of the slide. Can we use citations and policy to try and find and describe the policy impact that our scholarly work is having? And we'll do that by talking a little bit about policy documents and how we can collect them and look at them, and then kind of characterizing the data from a large database of policy documents collected by Overton. Looking for policy impact isn't the only thing you could be doing with citations. Of course, we've heard about from Lizzie's talk right at the beginning, the different uses of bibliometrics and the different kind of use cases for it. In general, I'm interested in this idea that you can take scholarly bibliometrics and apply it to the policy world. What can we learn from that? Can we evidence use case studies? Can we find journals that are good at reaching policymakers, identify experts? Can we derive metrics, potentially, about how good or lacking we might be in engaging with policymakers? But let's start right at the beginning. Unfortunately, we do have to define what we mean by a policy document. It kind of surprised me that there doesn't seem to be like a common agreement amongst everyone. If anyone knows different, I definitely want to talk to you. It'd be an interesting chat. But we could start off with a straw man, simple definition to say a policy document is a document written by a policymaker. So that would include things like official documents from government departments and agencies. Might include things from the legislative branch of government, so draft bills, reports, that kind of thing, or transcripts of committees, speeches, that kind of thing. And in the context of policy citations, that would show direct relationships between scholarly work and policy documents. So on the left hand here, there's a paper in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine in the UK, and I've kind of pulled out a paragraph here saying in this paper we suggest that we can tackle safety problems in healthcare by setting up this small permanent independent agency. And that paper is cited by the Draft Health Service Safety Investigations Bill, which is a bill that's, even though the date there is 2017, it's been going through the UK Parliament for the past 3 years. And they cite that paper, right? So they directly call back to the suggestion being made by the authors in the paper. But that's actually relatively rare. And when you start looking at policy citations and how they're citing scholarly work, often second order citations are more common. And what I mean by that is that the bill or the kind of final bit of policy, the policy document closest to the actual implementation, doesn't cite scholarly work directly. Instead, it goes through these translation steps. So there'll be a think tank that writes a policy brief, there'll be a research office in Parliament or the Congressional Research Service in the US and the equivalent. There'll be an IGO report, something like that. And that'll do a lot of the scholarly literature review, and it makes the ideas kind of more, not more palatable, but more easily picked up and used by policymakers. So if you want to handle this kind of translation step, we're going to have to broaden our definition of policy document and say not just documents written by policymakers, but also documents potentially written for policymakers, and include the examples that I gave before. So things like think tank policy briefs, working papers, research reports from NGOs, anything that's designed to influence the way policy is made. So that is quite broad. But there's more as well, because to get that intermediate step, we're going to need to include policy-to-policy citations in our network. So we're not just kind of bolting on policy to scholarly citations onto the existing scholarly network. We need to have these policy-to-policy networks as well. But as a quick sanity check, remember we talked about using citations in policy to find and describe policy impact, and are we sure that we can do that with just citations? As most of you will be aware, policy impact in general is a complicated thing, right? So in scholarly networks, citations are generally accepted as currency. And scholarly influence, I'm not necessarily sure they should be, but that's the way it is. It's gradually changing. And books and papers are the kind of discrete units of progress. But there aren't really equivalents when you're talking about policy impact. A policy contribution, the change that you make on policy as an academic could potentially be over many years and involve a lot of different interactions in different ways, and papers and expert workshops and interviews and all this kind of thing. So looking at just policy citations is only ever going to show part of the story. And furthermore, at what point does a citation become impact? So that draft Health Service Safety Investigations Bill that we saw before, it could be that the next step is that it actually improves lives for people. It has an impact. It makes a change in the real world. But for a lot of policy, it could be put away in a filing cabinet somewhere and forgotten about, or just quietly dropped, and you never hear about it ever again. And if that's the case, is it actually impact if your work went into shaping it? If it doesn't end up changing the way things work in the real world? And that's all the negative parts of it. But all that said, broadly speaking, a citation and policy document does reflect influence, not quality, as it can be heard in Lizzie's talk and elsewhere. It's not talking about how good a paper is in the cite. It just means that it's influenced the way the policymakers have thought. The policy citations can't trust all the different contributions to policy that a researcher makes. And not all the policy citations are going to represent impact. As we saw, the final result could be just forgotten about, or people can move on from it. But that's okay as long as we recognize those limitations. Policy citations are still useful. It is important to note that it's going to be important to examine the context. So again, what happened to the policy after it was written? Did it get put into practice? What kind of citation was it? Was it, to set the scene? Was it something, cited as part of a literature review? Or is it something more clear like the one below, where the document says, the inquiry is, I think, a parliamentary steering group says our inquiry was prompted by this paper. So there's a very direct link. The reason we're talking here today about this new policy is because of this paper. And that's going to be the case whenever you're dealing with policy documents. Generally, there's always going to be as much qualitative as quantitative analysis involved. So how do you actually get there? If we know what a policy document is and what kind of network, what the network looks like, how do you collect it all? And this is kind of the bad news. There are few standards for policy documents. Unlike journals, where part of the raison d'etre is to get content out there and make it as discoverable as possible, governments and agencies don't necessarily have the same imperatives. Think tanks do, because that's part of their job, but not necessarily official documentation. There's no common metadata standards or databases like Crossreference, PubMed, discovery layers like Google Scholar or Web of Science. And it's hard to find, collect, and clean documents as well. So it's hard to kind of collect documents off the bat yourself. What this means is that there are a few different sources, but there's no kind of one global standard. It's not like when you do a bibliometric analysis, you can say, well, we looked at things indexed in Web of Science or things indexed in Scopus, and people have a general understanding of what that means, or it's well documented. In policy, you're going to be working with a lot of different data sources, and it's critical to understand their coverage and the data biases of them, because that's what you have to use to be able to normalize things later on. More practically, though, I talked about characterizing the kind of data from that 3.5 million policy document set, and that's what we've done with Overton. So that's where Overton comes from, is to become one of these indexes for policy documents. And I won't talk about that in this presentation, but what I do want to do is take the data from there and try and establish some baselines. So let's answer some questions. And these are the ones that I've heard a lot. There are obviously others, and you can feel free to explore the data yourself later on. I'll talk about that at the end. But the questions I wanted to tackle were, first of all, did policy documents cite papers in the first place? How often does that happen? Do they cite old or new papers? What's the kind of lag time between the publication and first being picked up by policy? And what fraction of papers are ever cited in policy? So we saw this with all metrics, where the percentage changes over time, but obviously to begin with, it's not a every paper gets a medal kind of scenario. And the number of papers picked up by the news or in blogs, or you're talking about a third of everything ever published. Nowadays, I think a majority of papers are tweeted, but that wasn't always the case either. So what is that fraction when it comes to policy citations? And the answer for a lot of these questions is, unfortunately, it depends. It's a complicated area. It covers a lot of different sources. But if we look at 4 quite big sources of policy documents inside Overton anyway, so GovUK is the official repository for government documents from the United Kingdom. And GPO is the government publishing office for federal departments and agencies in the US. Brookings is a think tank, and the Publications Office of the European Union is basically official documents from agencies and, again, Directorate Generals from the EU. And you can see quite a wide range of percentages there. So GovUK, which includes a lot of what I would call administrative and kind of reporting documents as well, has quite a low percentage. Right? So about 10% of the documents on GovUK contain at least one citation to a scholarly paper. About 5% contain a cite of a different policy source, so something that isn't a UK government document. So that could be a think tank, or it could be a foreign government, or it could be an IGO, that kind of thing. There's slightly different cases for the GPO and the Publications Office, I think, because they have more, well, first of all, because they're at a kind of supranational level. So the GPO is working at a federal level rather than a state level, and has a lot of agency content in it. And the same with the Publications Office of the EU. But it's by no means all policy documents, right? It's fewer than half. Looking at things the other way around, so if we look at a selection of journals and look at the number of papers they published in 2015, at least according to PubMed, we can then look to see how many of them have been cited in policy in the past 5 years since they were published. And it's very discipline specific, as you might imagine. So in Nature Chemistry, 2% of the papers that were published in 2015 have been cited at least once. So that's not necessarily unsurprising, right? So it turns out that chemistry isn't big in policy. And then it goes up the way through +1, the Lancet, which makes a point of trying to reach policymakers, up to Health Affairs, which is a journal specifically designed to reach people working in health policy. So for Health Affairs, that's quite a good sign that they're managing to reach their intended audience. What's interesting to me is it doesn't correlate with volume or impact factor. So the Journal of Gambling Studies and Review of Faith and International Affairs are both small journals compared to the Lancet and +1 especially, and also relatively low impact journals. But they have an oversized influence for their size on policy. So there's just a couple more of these data slides, and I think all the slides are going to be available afterwards as well, so you can take a look at them in more depth. But the citation half-life for scholarly papers picked up in policy is just over 4 years. So for the scholarly papers published in 2010, that means that they got about half of the citations, policy citations that they'll ever get, or up to now anyway, just over 4 years after publication. So that's about mid-size. Again, when you're looking at scholarly citations, this is going to depend on discipline, right? So some In some places it'll be 6 years, in some places it'll be 2 years. So looking across all the policy, it's about the middle. And policy documents don't necessarily just cite recent papers. They go back quite far. So if we look at all of the papers cited by policy in 2020, and this is in Overton again, so that's the set we're working with, there's about 260,000 papers cited. And actually, half of them come from before 2013, were published before 2013. So there's a wide range there. It's not the case that policy is, looking at things published in the past 3 or 4 years only. On the contrary. And again, that changes by discipline. So for healthcare agencies, actually, the curve is a little bit later. So in general, it's looking for older papers. Okay, back to the kind of differences now between policy networks, citation networks, and scholarly citation networks. And the first most obvious one is that in the scholarly world, we've got citation norms and accepted styles. And in the policy world, these definitely doesn't exist. It really is like Lord of the Flies. You can kind of see where there was a structure once, and now it's kind of descended into anarchy. So self-cites are rife. Obviously, there's no kind of peer. Well, there is peer review, and your peers will read the work and probably comment on it. But there's no editorial control over who or what you're citing and good citation practice. So it's not completely uncommon to find, especially among think tanks, a document where the 5 papers cited are all other think tank pieces by the same author. There's even kind of the equivalent to citation cartels, and they're not designed to game a system, so they're not a cartel in that sense, but they are designed to provide kind of more marketing, I suppose, especially to the smaller think tanks. So an example would be something like the State Policy Network. So this is a libertarian think tank network in the US, funded by the Koch brothers, amongst other things. And the think tanks that are part of that network share content and expertise between them. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It really does amplify their voice. And from that perspective, it's a good thing. But from a tracking citations perspective, it's a bit misleading because, for example, these 3 think tanks might cite each other a lot more than you would otherwise expect. A less kind of nefarious, if you like, version of this is governments that tend to cite local policy. So this is maybe unsurprising again when you think about it, but if you look at Swedish government policy, the 3 universities where the most research being cited comes from are all in Sweden, Stockholm, Uppsala, and Lund. And in Brazil, equally, the top 3 universities are all Brazilian. So I'm going to wrap up, again, to keep things short. But in summary, I think looking at what policy documents cite can help highlight your impact. It's important to understand what that data kind of looks like and figure out the correct approach to it. The context, especially of the citation and the policy, is very important, so you can't just look at the numbers. They happen more often than you think. They're cited via an interim review rather than directly, so you do need to look at this policy-to-policy citations. As a guesstimate, about 5 to 10% of all papers appear, and the citation half-life is around 4 years. Like I said at the beginning, I think the easiest way to kind of get into this data, and I appreciate that it was just kind of a very shallow kind of glancing off the surface, is to explore for yourself. So the data is freely available for bibliometric research. If it's going into a paper or poster, there's no chance to use it. You can take data and do what you like. And feel free to email about that to me at euan@overton.io. From a research administrative perspective, it's slightly different. We have this off-the-shelf app, but we are looking for testers there too. And I'll leave it there. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks for listening.
All right, thank you, Euan. We have several questions for you, so I'll see if I can feed you all of them. Okay, so the first one is that, is there any plan to make the insight given by the citizen reciprocal? That is, whether papers are citing policies, so that we can completing the cycle of impact as it were?
Yes, there is. So the main blocker there is access to citations from papers. And the good thing is there's a lot of kind of open work going into this, open citations. The bad thing is that often when publishers process references, they throw away anything that doesn't have a DOI in Crossref. So even if they're contributing to open citations, the kind of references out to policy aren't there. So it means you have to work directly with publishers, and it's quite a lot of effort. But I think that is another kind of important step. I'd love to do it.
Good, thank you. Next one, are there examples of policy documents that only cite other policy documents? If so, how do you treat those?
Yeah, there's quite a lot. So again, the closer to the kind of actual implementation you get, the further away from the scholarly citations you tend to get as well. And so the way you would handle them is to have that policy-to-policy citation network linked in. So you could see that policy document A is the one we want to treat as impact, and it cites this intermediary policy document. And then we know that intermediary, cites the DOI that we're interested in.
Okay. And what was the rationale for selecting the journals that cited policy? Is it just random, or were there specific reasons for the selection?
They were semi-random. I wanted to pick health affairs because I knew it targeted policymakers, and I was interested in PLOS One. That also usually does quite well in these kind of things. In all metrics measures, they usually do quite well. But the other ones were mainly just looking around for different subject areas.
Okay. And when you talk about policy documents citing papers here, is some fuzzy matching on author name or title, etc. involved? I would be surprised if they all have proper references sections with DOI.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. They definitely do not have proper reference sections. Well, not even bibliographies at the end. So often they'll be in table captions or footnotes on pages and this kind of thing. So yes, I would say 80% of the citation matches we do in Overton. Obviously, your mileage can vary. You could use lots of different systems. But around 80% of the policy citation matches we find are from doing fuzzy text matching against cross-refs and databases of books and things like that.
And wouldn't it be interesting to check whether and to what extent research assessment policies within institutions or funders cite papers on Bibliometrics?
Yeah, it is. That is an interesting question. I've done it with altmetrics before. I was just kind of professional interest, and you can kind of see who's been cited the most in policy and this kind of thing. It's quite fun. The research assessment, there is a question about what level of policy should be included in these kinds of systems. And so you can say, okay, well, we definitely want, say, international policy with ideals like United Nations, this kind of thing, and national policy from national governments and states and cities. But how granular do you want to get? Do you want to include, for example, policies at large institutions? They probably affect a lot of people, but are they of broad interest to the other users of the system? So there is kind of a caveat there. So it depends what level of policy you want to track.
Okay, I think we have one last question. Okay. So were there any trends in the cited research coming from publicly funded research grants, or was it not tracked? So this is something I'd love to look into, but what we're lacking is the grant data to be able to hook up grants to particular papers. So there is some of that in Overton, but it tends to be UK biased or from Fundref, which is very patchy. So it's hard to kind of make generalizations about different funders and the outcomes associated with them.
So I think we're going to have to leave it there in the interest of time. So thank you again, Euan, for presenting today. And I think we'll go ahead and just move on to our next speaker.
Thanks.
So up next is Teresa Schultz from the University of Nevada, Reno. to talk about open access in the news. Teresa, are you there?
Hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Perfect. Okay. I will share my screen. And then, hi everyone. My name is Teresa Schultz. I am the social sciences librarian at the University of Nevada, Reno. But my specialty area is really in scholarly communications, open access, open educational resources, copyright, all that good stuff. And that's where a lot of my research is based. So today I'm going to talk about a research project that I did looking at news coverage of open access. So pretty on topic, actually related to what Euan was talking about, but instead of government policies, I was more interested in how the news media reports on specifically open access research. And a little bit more background about me. I am actually a former journalist. I worked as a newspaper reporter for 10 years, so this was part of my interest in this. Because as a journalist, I did have it come up where I struggled to get access to research articles that I wanted to mention in an article I was writing. Sorry, one moment. All right. So kind of, just some background as why I think this is important. So obviously, this is pretty well known, I think, at this point, but, open access is very much there to make research freely available to everyone, not just those at an institution who can afford it or afford access to, subscriptions. And there's been quite a number of studies done, and I just realized I put my citations on the wrong bullet point. They should be on the second bullet point. But a lot of studies have been done looking at the impact of open access research when it comes to citations. And generally, for the most part, these studies have shown that, yes, making your article or your research open access does correlate to increased citations. But again, the point of open access is to make it freely available to everyone. So not just academics, but non-academics, the government, but also the news media. And part of my interest in the news media, obviously, from my background, but also just because, when I was kind of looking into altmetric.com, you'll see that's where I get a lot of my data from. They actually weigh news media, a mention from the news media, the highest. They give it the greatest weight out of any other mention, which is, in my opinion, kind of just goes to show that it's a lot different having, New York Times, especially, a newspaper with the impact of the New York Times to write an article based on, a news article based on a research article that someone wrote, than, someone going on Twitter and tweet about it. So Altmetrics was really made the study really easy because, again, news media mentions are one of the things that they do count. So prior research into this, there has been some rather narrowed research done into do the news media cover open access more than they would cover what I would call paywalled articles. And it's been kind of mixed. Some have found a positive correlation, specifically one study that looked at climate change research, and then one that looked at research by Finnish researchers. And for that one, it was a greater chance of receiving a news mention, although not necessarily receiving more news mentions. But for others, there was no correlation, a positive correlation between OA and news media mentions. And specifically, there was one that looked at preprints in bioarchive. And preprints are, articles that have not been accepted or peer-reviewed yet. And so, I think there was some other it was a very small component there of open access articles looked at. And then another study looked specifically at articles from Nature Communication, and this is kind of older, and it's back when Nature Communication was still a hybrid OA journal. So for those of you not familiar, it is now Gold OA. But this was back when it was just hybrid, so some of the articles were being made OA, but not all. All right, so my research questions specifically, I wanted to see, does the article publication type, and by that I mean gold OA, green hybrid OA, or paywalled, influence whether articles are likely to receive a news mention at all? So, they will receive at least one or none. And I'll explain in a moment why I grouped green and hybrid together. The second question was, does article publication type influence how many news mentions an article receives, over paywalled articles? Sorry. And then finally, I was interested in how other factors kind of affect this, such as time, discipline, and the GIF quartile, or the journal impact factor quartile. Okay, so my methodology, I focused on journals with a journal impact factor. I have a lot of opinions on the journal impact factor. I don't necessarily think it's the greatest thing ever, but at the same time, I was going on the assumption that journalists would most likely be most likely to look at journals with a journal impact factor, just because for them it might be a little bit more comforting and they know it, they're familiar with it, and other research has shown that. And so I kind of came up with 8 broad areas that so most of these include 2 or 3 smaller, more narrow journal citation report categories. And these categories basically came about because these are the categories that news media have been shown to cover, or they were just categories that seemed like it might be of interest to the news media in some way. And so these, I do have health. I did create a separate one for nutrition and exercise because that's such a big one. Environment, aerospace, so physics, astronomy, general science, and those are the journals, the large journals like Nature or Science, and PLOS One. Finance, which is also business, social science, and then education. I tried to get the top 5 both paywalled and gold OA journals from each quartile in these categories. I did have a case. There were 2 instances with paywall journals. One was actually in 2 categories, so I just ended up taking it out of 1 category. I just only counted it towards 1. And then I later realized that PNAS is actually, or the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, is actually now bronze OA, which is just kind of a whole different ball game, and so I took it out of my study. So that left me with 158 paywall journals. There were not always 5 gold A journals per category, or per quartile, I'm sorry. And so in those instances, I just took whatever OA journals there were, and so there were only 128 gold OA journals. So overall, I was looking at 286 journals. I then ran the ISSNs for the 2 batches of journals, so paywalled and gold, through the altmetric.com Explorer dashboard. And I basically was looking for any articles from these journals that had been published from 2010 through 2018 that had received a mention in the news media from 2010 to, at that point, it was May 2019 when I did this. And one thing to note, so I ran the gold OA articles or journals separately, and then when you run the paywall journals, you can choose to separate out green and hybrid OA articles, but they combine the green hybrid together. So that's ultimately, I just grouped those 2 in my study, which I would have preferred to have, separated them, but it is what it is. And then I just took the article metadata, other article metadata from Web of Science for all articles in these published during that same time period in these journals. I did not include technically all articles. I limited it to things that would have been actually covered by news. So I did not, some of them I did not include things like book reviews, letters to the editors, actual news articles from journals like Science and Nature. Those I did not include. And then I used RStudio to clean the data and RStudio and Stata to analyze the data. Okay. So overall, there were a total of almost 600,000 articles, 590,915. The majority of them were gold OA articles, 66%, followed by paywall articles and green hybrid OA articles. A small subset of those articles had received actual news mentions, so only 77,000 of the 590,000 articles had received at least 1 news mention, which is pretty common when looking at prior research into how much the news media covers the scholarly literature. And honestly, that's actually probably on the high side, and my guess is that's because I was focusing on journal impact factor journals. You will notice, so 53.8% of the articles that had received at least a new mention were gold OA articles, 22.9% were paywalled articles, and 23.3% were green hybrid OA articles. So definitely the green hybrid OA articles, when you look at their total share of all articles, their share of articles with the news mention definitely jumped up. total, there were 1.4 million news mentions for all articles, with some articles receiving multiple news mentions. The median news mention for all articles was 3, and that was also true when I separated out for gold OA and paywalled articles. They also had a median of 3. When I looked at green hybrid articles, they received a median news mentions of 5 news mentions. So because my data is count data, and I had a high number of 0, research articles with 0 news mentions, I went with the 0 inflated negative binomial analysis. And I did include other factors. I included the GIF. I believe I included the eigenfactor, and then data publication were my other independent variables. And it did show a positive correlation for both gold and green hybrid OA and news mention with p less than 0.1, or 0.01, sorry. So then I started looking at what are the top journals receiving news mentions. And PLOS One was the highest. 16.5% of all articles receiving a news mention came from PLOS One. And that was followed by Nature Communication with 10.3% of their articles, making up, all articles using the news mentions, followed by Nature at 9.7%, Scientific Reports at 9.6%, and Science at 8.4%. What was interesting to me, though, is that, while PLOS One was at the top as far as, that goes, when you looked at the percent of all articles published in PLOS One that received a news mention, it was only 7%. And, I think we're mostly familiar with PLOS One. It's a large mega journal. They publish a ton of articles, so that does kind of make some sense that only a small portion of their articles are receiving news mentions. The numbers do definitely jump for those bigger name journals. Nature Communication had 41% of its articles with a news mention, Nature 51%, and Science with 52%. All of which do tend to make sense. Those are pretty well known. Or Nature Science, especially Nature Communication, they do have the Nature brand behind them. It's a newer journal, but it definitely comes from that well-respected brand. Breaking it down by discipline, it was definitely kind of across the board. Definitely general science saw the biggest benefit for gold OA articles being cited by the news media, which again, when you think about PLOS One having the dominant there, and also Scientific Reports and Nature Communication, it makes sense that it's such a large share. It was about 65%, I believe, of gold OA articles from the general science journals. Nutrition, exercise, and environment were a little bit more split, with gold OA articles receiving about half the news mentions from those categories. But then it definitely starts dropping education and health. I was a little surprised by health, although gold OA didn't really make up even 20% of the news mentions. Green OA did actually see a significant, as well as astrophysics, which of course with archive, that's such a common thing now. That does make more sense. And also, not surprisingly, the social sciences, education, business, economics, they didn't see as many of OA articles receiving a news mention, which just makes sense as those disciplines don't have as strong of an OA background at this point in time. And then I broke it down by year. You will notice that 2010, 2011, there were very few news mentions. I would like to note altmetric.com came into existence in 2012, so that explains why. There was definitely a growth for all types of articles and news mentions, and it was fairly even through about 2015. With paywall, it was kind of hanging a little under gold and then green and hybrid OA articles. And then they really started taking off 2015 to 2016. They kind of plateaued for most articles from about 2016 to 2017. And then interestingly, green hybrid OA articles saw a bit of a drop from 2017 to 2018. Gold did as well, but it was not nearly as much. And gold articles do still make up the majority in 2018 of articles receiving a news mention. I did not include news mentions from 2019 because, again, I only went through May of 2019 when I was doing my data collection. That's when it was. But what was interesting to note is that it looked like the news mentions were going down still. Considering it was 5 months through the year, I think they were still behind pace for the news mentions for 2018. but I don't really know why. And then looking at journal quartile, I will tell you, so I'm only showing the percentages here. I will tell you the vast majority of news mentions are from journals in the top quartile. That's just like, it's a huge difference. But when looking at the news mentions within each quartile, definitely gold dominates the most when it comes to the first quartile, receiving just slightly less than half of the news mentions, and then green hybrid OA receives a significant amount as well. And then it just starts dropping, especially for gold OA, as we go into the second, third, and fourth quartiles, although the third green hybrid OA actually does fairly well there as well. All right, so basically, thank you to allmetric.com for providing access to their Explorer dashboard. Sorry, I was trying to go fast, but if there's any questions.
Thank you, Teresa. We do have a question. Do you think the reason that journals like Nature and Science have a larger percentage of articles with the news mention has to do with them actually having press departments and placing stories with the news, and a much larger number of articles getting press releases?
Yes, definitely, and that was something I was not able to include as a factor in my study. So yes, but I think it's not just Nature and Science, because if you think about it, Scientific Reports and Nature.Communication, they have the same power behind them, right? And PLOS One, I'm sure, has as their own, they're strong enough now. I think that's probably why we see so many top quartile journals receiving news mentions compared to second, third, and fourth quartile journals. They probably just don't have that, that brand behind them or that power. So yeah, I do think press releases are a big factor.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great. So I think that's going to go ahead and conclude this particular session. So we will take a quick break. And again, you're welcome to hang out in the WebEx event space. And we'll get going again at 3:45 Eastern with a training from Tom Zamojan from Clarivate Analytics. Thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you soon.